name is Andrew Penner. I'm the president of the AEE Canada East chapter, which is here in Ottawa, but also spans to Atlantic Canada. And we're really excited to have a great slate of speakers on a topic that is ever evolving, building standards. So before we get rolling, I just wanted to give a shout out to this chapter sponsors. So sponsors are extremely important to chapters like ours. They enable us to fulfill our mission financially, and through their support, they confirm our relevance, and they provide credibility, of course. So they expose our members to new ideas and ways of thinking, and they help us grow our network and our influence. So what you see on the screen now is this year's sponsors. I think as up to date as I have been able to make it. If your company doesn't, if you don't see your company's name there and you think that it ought to be, then you can always reach out to somebody on the board in the chapter, and we're always happy to add new corporate partners to our team. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Of course, we are a chapter of the Association of Energy Engineers. That association was founded a long time ago, 1977, long before energy efficiency was popular, common, or even considered to be essential. And over the years, it's grown to be a pretty substantial international organization with over 18,000 members. Of course, there's over 100 chapters. There's over 100 chapters similar to ours around the country now in 100 countries. And basically, we are the local expression of AEE's pledge to be local, global AEE. So,
good morning, everybody. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Mitchell Niles. I'm the manager of the Energy Systems Department here at JL Richards for the Ottawa office. And as anybody is aware that's attending online, we are recording this webinar. So just to make everybody aware that the intention of AEE Canada East is to record and make available the webinar content for posting online via YouTube for future consumption, and their participation implies consent. Everybody in the room and still intending, if you still haven't run out of the room now, we're taking that you are okay with this being recorded and going up on YouTube at a later date.
And a few pictures.
Yes, so always a few pictures for the LinkedIn page. The AEE Canada East takes no responsibility for the views expressed by our panelists, as their thoughts are their own, and the AEE Canada East takes no responsibility for the decisions made based on the content expressed by AEE Canada East volunteers or panelists. So again, welcome everybody in line, online and in person. The second point that I'd like to just do a quick land acknowledgement and give thanks to the lands on which we live and work and to the people who have cared for it. The land in Ottawa here is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Beg and the Algonquin people. So here's our agenda for today. I'll run through these housekeeping items as quickly as I can. Joan Haysom, who's our Innovative Energy Market Chief, will come up for a few opening remarks about JL Richards and our background. I'll dive into an overview of green development and building standards and regulations. And it's very high level. We could spend an entire week at a seminar on all these topics, but I wanted to give a brief overview of what the kind of current state of these different standards are. And then Rebecca Hagan from the City of Ottawa will jump in to give us an overview of their latest high performance development standard that will be coming into effect in a few months in the city. And with that, I'll pass it over to Joan.
Thank you so much to Andrew for being the overall organizer that we worked very closely with to pull this event together, and to all of my team for really doing a lot of the work of putting this together and being strong team members. JL Richards is multidisciplinary. We have engineers, architects, and planners, and we a little bit of an overview of the firm. I don't want to take too long, but I think it's really important to understand our context in terms of how we deliver energy services to the industry. We're a company of over 400 employees, and we're 100% employee owned. Nearly every employee in the company owns a portion of the company and has a vote and say on the leadership structure of the company and on how it makes money and makes profit that return back to all those shareholders. And that creates a really close bond and connection between employees all caring about the work that we do. We're 100% Canadian, yet we have global reach projects in over 75 countries. And we're a long-standing member of the Platinum Club of Canada's Best Managed Companies. This is an incredibly short synopsis of a company that is in fact founded in 1956, so approaching, is that 70 years of being in business. Started off as engineering, added planning, later on added architectural services. Do I get to the point here? Right in the very middle of that page, you'll see our team, the Innovative Energy team. We had a team of folks with experience, and we had been working together that joined as a group in 2018 to form this service. We're now been here 5 years and really growing, expanding, really have a strong, firm foothold in the work that we do. J.L. Richards has acquired a few other companies along the way. Porcupine Engineering Services, which is a lot in the mining sector up north. LCI was known here within Ottawa. Excellent mechanical and electrical industrial capabilities, and et cetera. We serve many different markets. Buildings market is probably the largest and where many of you in this room would have had the interactions. We also have a strong civil, municipal, and planning market that does a lot of the work within Ottawa, a lot of the infrastructure. Environmental infrastructure department does a water, wastewater treatment facilities and the infrastructure behind that. Our mining sector, very much focused around our more northerly offices in Ontario, but works across Canada as well in the mining sector. My area is innovative energy, as I've been telling you a little bit about. The industrial comes through from the LCI acquisition, and special projects is really sort of just a focus area to think about when we like to work with a number of partners to deliver best-in-class projects, specialized delivery services, so design build, integrated project delivery services, some really fine-tuned custom projects. They often end up being large, but quickly built facilities. And JLR has a long history of that with buildings in Ottawa that include palladium factory for Nortel, which of course didn't operate for very long, the Canadian Tire Centre itself as well. And we also think of ourselves in terms of the disciplines that are here at the company. So there are 5 engineering disciplines within this: civil, electrical, mechanical, environmental, and structural, as well as planning and architecture. And we can tackle basically any project that comes in our door. And we like to work on complicated multidisciplinary projects along the way. And we care very much about the planet that we live on and the environment and the people that we work with. So we have a focus on Indigenous relationships, actually long-standing interaction with a number of First Nations and supporting their buildings and infrastructure. Sustainability is important to the company and a growing part of our delivery model. And social responsibility has been a long-term part of the company. So 2 slides here just to set the context. I think this isn't all that new to everybody here that's in the room. I'm so pleased, and thank you everyone for coming and joining in and helping to build this community of people that understand energy and carbon reductions and how we can all work together to actually get to where we're headed. As you know, the history of the world is population growth and demand growth for energy, and that's typically seen a growth with GHGs over time. So this is the highest line that's on there. Don't know how to get the mouse to the point. And then there's been building codes, more efficient products, even the LEED type of design, building design standard has brought that curve down, but that's has been seeing an increase in GHG emissions over time. There we go. But we know that we need to get to significant carbon reductions over time. So there's different paths that can be taken from where we are to where we need to get to, and there's different targets down the road there. So you can see those by some of those X's. Our job today and our job in terms of energy and carbon in buildings is to, within the building sector, try to accelerate, make sure that there is a downward path so that by 2030, new buildings are primarily net zero carbon. And by 2050, the entire building stock. has a very low carbon footprint. And I borrowed this from the City of Ottawa. Some of us in our team have had a long collaborative effort working with the city on the Energy Evolution Program, and pleased to see where they've come to. This is their analysis of within the City of Ottawa where all of the GHG savings reductions need to occur to hit net zero carbon by 2050. And our topic today is the bar along the bottom, the dark green of new buildings, primarily. The building standard will primarily tackle that tranche of all the work that we need to do. So Joe Richards works in most of all of these tranches, and our energy team is interacting with all of our disciplines and all of our markets to work towards reducing the carbon in all of those sectors. But today's topic, as you know, is new buildings. So I will leave it there as having hopefully set the stage for understanding what some of these design standards can do, how they work, how they're driving us forward. Thank you so very much.
Okay, quick transition. So up on the screen here, I've got a few of the big name standards that I wanted to do a brief overview of today. I've kind of grouped them into four main categories. You have the model codes, where they're national level codes that are referenced by many other codes or built off of. The regulatory codes that are put in place by authorities having jurisdiction and are kind of enforced either through legislation or contract requirements, such as the City of Ottawa's new high performance development standard that's coming out, as well as design standards and these are more of the green leading standards that are voluntary standards typically pursued to showcase high performance buildings. And a little bit separate from all of that is the operating standards that focus less on the design of a building, but then how a building is actually operating when it's up and running. There's many other standards that I could go on. As I said, this could be a 2-week seminar conference, but I wanted to focus on these main ones today. So the baseline reference models. So these two ones are typically set to give a baseline that's compared against it. So NECB and ASHRAE 90.1 are often used for these baselines, and many funding programs and grants require use these as examples to build off of you need to be 25% better than ASHRAE 90.1 or NECB. ASHRAE 90.1 is probably the grandfather or grandparent of energy standards. It was probably the first comprehensive energy standard for commercial buildings, and it's commonly referenced by many other standards. This is the one that is most up to date and revised throughout the years. And a lot of new standards will borrow aspects from ASHRAE 90.1 or just point to ASHRAE 90.1 in putting in what they want to have as their energy targets. There's prescriptive and performance compliance paths throughout it. The performance path has many of the schedules that is used in energy models for different standards and including compliance with this one. And the prescriptive path has set a lot of the standards and efficiency requirements for many pieces of equipment assemblies throughout the years. NECB, the National Energy Code for Buildings, is the kind of the Canadian equivalent that was built off of and is structured very similar to the ASHRAE 90.1 standard. It again has a prescriptive trade-off and performance compliance method. And many of the parameters when you are doing a performance-based model have to be identical so that you really do get an apples-to-apples comparison to show what your performance base is compared to that baseline. Well, the Ontario Building Code SB 10, I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with this requirement that's come in, and I know it's a headache to a lot of architects out there when they can't have their building full of windows because it doesn't meet certain SB 10 requirements. But SB 10 is a good example of something that points to ASHRAE 90.1 and NECB as what to use for reference models. Again, has the prescriptive trade-off and performance compliance paths. And I know there's some changes that are expected to be coming out because this is 2012 is very long overdue and it is kind of an old code. But the provincial government has been slow moving to eventually update this. Hopefully this year, next year. I don't know if anybody else has a crystal ball that can say when those changes are actually going to be coming into effect. I wanted to include the BC Energy Step Code because this is another one that's been, it has a long history of kind of pushing the envelope for building design, and it's really created BC as a leader for this. So this Energy Step Code became an optional compliance path that municipalities could put in place to require buildings that are being constructed to be a little more energy efficient. Different municipalities implemented it in different ways. Some used it as a requirement for building permit or rezoning, and others didn't have it as a requirement but put in incentives. When BC rolled this out, a lot of municipalities provided training workshops to energy modelers, developers, and constructors on how to meet this standard to kind of lessen the shock of these new requirements coming into place. And as a result of this standard, BC has become the leading edge for energy modeling requirements, creating guidelines for air tightness testing and thermal bridging calculation that a lot of other energy codes throughout the country point to as guidelines and references. But coming back to Ontario, the City of Toronto's Toronto Green Standard has been around since about 2018 and has set the idea that all new buildings in Toronto should be net zero carbon by 2030. We had the most recent update of last year, version 4 came into effect. But since 2018, there's been 4 different tiers of targets for the 5 most common building archetypes. And every 4 years, what used to be the tier 1 requirements, or what used to be tier 2 now becomes tier 1, and they get more stringent as each year goes on, as they approach 2030, hoping that all new buildings will be net zero carbon by then. It has additional prescriptive requirements, such as renewable energy, resiliency, water conservation, stormwater runoff. And this standard has been kind of the inspiration for a lot of other municipalities to create their own standards based off of Toronto, but then tweaking it for their own unique purposes. An example that we worked on was with the town of Caledon, where they came up with their own corporate green building standard. And I'm using this here not to kind of showcase how great the town of Caledon is, but just as an example that many small towns, universities, or other organizations that have a big building stock have started to create their own green building standard that they want to apply to any new construction. So it becomes more of a blanket requirement that they can put in place, so that they don't have to constantly put in all these requirements on any new RFP and design. They have a standard that's been developed and tested and can be pointed to for any of their own buildings that are coming up. And we're seeing this come up more and more. I know York University recently released an RFP to develop their own corporate green building standard. So going into the voluntary standards to showcase how great your building is, LEED has got to be kind of the showcase one that's always out there, and it's what people think of when they think of a green building. LEED 4 was released in 2019, and it's administered by the Canada Green Building Council. It has energy performance as one of the requirements, but it's not a big part of LEED. For it, you can get a lot of points by just being 5% better than ASHRAE 90.1 in 2010. So it's not you don't have to have a very high performance building from an energy perspective to get all of your points for LEED. LEED has started to drop off over the years, and this graph on the screen shows buildings that were certified by year in Canada. There's the different colors for the different levels, but you can see there's a huge peak in 2013, and it's really dropped off for the last years. And we've seen that on the consulting side of less buildings asking for LEED certification, and instead asking for LEED-like certification or follow these rules of LEED, but don't actually go through the rigorous prescription process, which kind of been a drawback of some of these standards that are very prescriptive, rigorous, have a long, arduous certification process that building owners want the benefits of it, but don't want to have to go through the hassle of hiring a LEED consultant and checking all of the boxes off. Green globes is kind of an alternative to LEED that has shown up. It's not as popular as a LEED standard, but we've started to see it show up more often from some federal agencies and other universities that are picking this over LEED as their requirement. It's similar to LEED with a points-based system. Green globes has 1,000 points-based system. And the latest version of Green Globes rewards reductions in embodied carbon, which is starting to be another aspect that's added into a lot of these standards, is really getting focused on not just your operational carbon emissions, but the embodied carbon that went into the construction of the building. Moving out of LEED came the Zero Carbon Building Standard, which was developed by the Canada Green Building Council, and version 3 of the standard was just released last year. What's different from this standard opposed to LEED and Green Globes is there's only one certification level. It is either a zero carbon building or it is not. There's not gold, platinum, or other levels. There's all these requirements to meet the standard, and you can get the certification. What's also different from a lot of the design standards is this is broken up into a design standard that can be issued to a project at the issued for construction stage of that drawing package, and a performance standard that is issued after the building has been up and running. It really is tying in not just how buildings are designed, but how they operate over a year. The latest version of the design standard has included requirements for reduced embodied carbon, as were previous versions you got credit for reducing your embodied carbon, but it wasn't a mandatory requirement. And this standard is commonly referenced for many federal funding agencies when they're calling out a net zero building or the new construction needs to be to net zero standards. When you read through the fine print, they're eventually pointing back to this standard that they want them to meet this to get their funding levels. Moving off of the design side and into more of the operation side, BOMA BEST has probably been the most recognized certification that building operators can get to show how great their building is running. And I think many of us here were at the presentation yesterday where they talked about BOMA BEST 4 that had just come out. This standard focuses more on the building operation side, and it's not really for a design standard. It has 5 different certification levels, and one of the great things that I like that they've changed with this is the lowest level that used to be BOMA BEST certified is now BOMA BEST baseline. It really represents what you're doing at that lowest level. Is you haven't achieved anything yet, but you are setting a baseline for how to improve your building. This standard focuses on areas besides just energy. It also includes water, waste reduction, emissions and effluents, indoor environment, and environmental management. The certification process is largely through their online questionnaire. There is some assessments that have to be done and uploaded as a part of this, but it is really the established standard for building operators. And I know there's a lot of commercial office buildings around town that are proud to have that little BOMA BEST tombstone sitting in their lobby whenever you walk in. On the operations side, there's the Energy Star standard. So I know a lot of people might recognize that symbol for something that's on their dryer or fridge, but Energy Star also does certifications for buildings. This was a system that was originally developed in the US, and Natural Resources Canada brought it over and adopted it in Canada. It focuses primarily on building energy consumption. Buildings are rated on a scale out of 100 against similar building types across the country. If your building received a rating of 50, it shows that you're kind of in the national median against other building types. Any building that achieves a rating of 75 or higher can earn this Energy Star certification level, and it's an annual certification that needs to be done every year. So like the Zero Carbon Building Standard, we're seeing this show up a lot more on federal funding requirements, that whenever they're pointing to retrofits, this is the standard that they're asking to be achieved, or at least having the building operators submit their energy portfolio requirements. So I know that was fast and furious. I'm going to take a few minutes to switch over the presentation before Rebecca jumps in, but I think me and Joan are happy to answer any questions anybody has while I jump through these. No questions?
You'd ask one of those standards, which one do you like to work in?
The Zero Carbon Building Standard is probably the one that I like the best, and for just being in a design house where we get to build zero carbon buildings. It is, because it's kind of simple in its execution, that they're just looking at zero carbon as the target, and it gives the freedom to the designer to, you decide how you're going to achieve it. That's where kind of the drawbacks of LEED and Green Globes is there's so many prescriptive requirements that you kind of end up with this green Frankenstein of a building where you've got bike racks, but it's in a location that no one is ever practically going to bike to. But you have bike racks there because you'll get that standard point. That's where the Zero Carbon Building Standard is focused primarily on reducing carbons on the operational and embodied carbon front. And it gives the designers kind of the complete freedom of how to achieve that standard. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Is your team working across the country on these standards, or are you focusing on specific ones? And are you using a different standard in different places because your clients are asking for that? I know you mentioned some of the federal government things, but are you working with any private companies that are specifically asking for certain standards? And how does that match up nationally across the country?
It's less geographic and it's more client based.
Okay.
So a lot of the municipalities that are looking for federal funding, they're looking at the zero carbon building standard. Same thing with the First Nations group, because they're all going after the same federal programs and they're pointing to that standard.
Right.
That's kind of where it's being driven from. We've seen Crown agencies pointing to other standards, or again, going to the zero carbon building standard. The BOMA best is the one that shows up more often in commercial real estate, but it comes down to the individual client and what they find important. On the private side, we're seeing less of a draw for standards if the client doesn't care about getting the certification, showcasing it, and more just on back to the old like energy efficiency or reducing their own carbon emissions. But it's if they don't see the value in the standard, it's hard to convince them that there is value that's there. And we are starting to see more of a, like how there was a LEED like requirement coming out in a lot of RFPs to not get LEED certified, but be LEED like. We're now seeing that happening with the zero carbon building standard of don't certify to it, but build as a zero carbon building.
Are tenants not looking for that? Like as part of, like you have a commercial building or light industrial building, that tenants I would think are looking for that on the brokerage side too, are they not? So like you should be building to a certain standard to prove that you're meeting that standard almost. Is that not a requirement anymore or something that they're looking for?
I think it is one of the influencers that's out there in the space. And tenants are starting to have more voice, more impact, more knowledge to be able to influence that. James McNeil, obviously know that best because he does brokerage
for sure
within the city and beyond. I think there's a certain level of commercial buildings, commercial tenancies that are starting to recognize the value to their asset of being green, being certified green.
Right. Yeah, like it makes sense to like want to follow the standard but not necessarily get a certification. But I guess if the tenant is asking for proof, just wondering like how we prove it, right? Like we can be doing the best thing, but if we don't prove it, sometimes it's a little difficult. That's why I was curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the scenario where a certification has a particular value.
Yeah.
We also support a number, like lots of different types of clients that certification was never really the plan or a driving factor, but we're more and more having that start a design conversation about, well, what are your low energy and low carbon opportunities, and just doing that options analysis and return on investment of different choices. So we're really pleased to see that evolution happening in the industry. The standards are there to provide an overall guidance, but even when things aren't certified, the industry is starting to understand and move forward.
Which is amazing. It's good.
Yeah.
From the tenant side, yes, they're starting to ask for that, especially the big corporate tenants. Especially when we're talking retrofits, which we see fairly often. It's a little out of scope from this, but there isn't a great standard right now to say we have significantly lower carbon emissions to X or something like that. So we have seen some clients start to ask us for it to show that they're reducing their carbon emissions, show what the carbon emission reduction is. But there's nothing to say, there's no standard out there to actually get certified to.
Right.
Say we're down to 15% carbon emissions.
So they may be pointing to SBTI, like, hey, we're trying to follow that standard, or just
The one I'm working on specifically right now is basically just showing their tenants where they're heading and what their plan is without any certification attached.
That's fair. Yeah. Open data. Thank you.
All right. Ready to move on to the next? Thank you for letting me come talk to you guys today. So I'm gonna talk about what the city's doing in terms of our green development standard that'll be implemented through our site plan control and plan of subdivision process. So I'll go through this fairly quickly and try and leave some time for some good conversation and questions at the end. So I'll go through kind of the background, how we ended up with this standard, some of the process pieces of how it'll be implemented, and then I'll focus on our energy modeling report and community energy plan parts of the standard. I'll present briefly what else is in the standard. I wasn't planning on speaking to them today, but I can certainly answer any questions if anybody wants to get into some of the details. So the High Performance Development Standard is a collection of voluntary and required metrics that define high performance for the city. And it's a holistic look, looking at how to advance health, the performance related to health, energy efficiency, safety, green and ecology, as well as resiliency and accessibility. We're certainly not the first green development standard in Ontario. Here's a list of many of the others. Toronto, I think their adoption year was 2006 for their voluntary standard, but a little bit later than that for when it became mandatory. So we're many years behind them in terms of adoption. They've very much been the leader in Ontario. And I think even since this slide has been created, there have been more municipalities coming on board with green development standards in Ontario. So this all sort of started way back in 2015 when the city started its renewable energy strategy, which was later renamed to Energy Evolution, which aims to set the path for how we're going to respond to our climate goals and climate targets. So then in 2019, City of Ottawa Council declared a climate emergency, which helped to kind of put a little bit more pressure and start moving some of these big projects forward out of energy evolution. Also in 2019, we brought forward our climate change master plan and had our new greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for both the city as a corporation, as well as the city more broadly, the whole community targets set. So I'll get into those a little bit later. And then in 2020, we brought forward energy evolution strategy, which is how we're going to try and achieve those reduction targets. And as part of that, we identified the high performance development standard as one of the tools available to municipalities to address greenhouse gas emissions in the new construction sector. To bring forward the high performance development standard, we had to have policies within our new official plan, which was brought forward in 2021 and approved by the province late last year. And then in 2022, we brought forward our high performance development standard, which council approved. And just earlier this week, we brought forward our report to committee on the new timeline for implementation for the high performance development standard. So that's gone through and been approved by committee, and it goes to council on May 10th. That gives you just kind of an overview of the history of things. So the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the community, we're essentially working towards 100% reduction from our 2012 baseline by 2050, with getting almost all the way there by 2040. So it's easy to focus on that 100% by 2050 number, but 96 by 2040 is a very difficult target to get to as well. On the corporate side, we're advancing a little bit faster. They need to have 100% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2040. And so this was all informed by our energy evolution model, which essentially modeled out how we would be performing from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, including growth based on business as planned, which is shown as the top line of this graph. And then each sector identifies what portion of the reductions we would expect to see from the various sectors. So today we're focusing on new buildings, which make up about 8% of our emission reductions. The City of Ottawa has also, as part of our climate change master plan, done climate projections work, which we partnered with the National Capital Commission on. This chart here is showing the high carbon emission scenario. I think we modeled out 3 different scenarios, low, medium, high in terms of carbon emissions, and then have very detailed results on what the implications are going to be. This is a snapshot of it. I can send you the link to the complete package. It includes future cooling degree days, future heating degree days, all sorts of details on future precipitation levels and those kinds of things. But some pretty stark numbers all up there. The general synopsis is it's getting warmer, wetter, and wilder. So significantly more very hot days, significantly more extreme weather events, and significantly more precipitation in certain parts of the year. So coming back to the high performance development standard, the policy context for that, we're given our authority for having this standard from the Planning Act, which then directs us to have policy framework within our official plan. And then that sets the pathway for having our mandatory standard, which is implemented through our plan of subdivision and our site plan control processes. So the high performance development standard does not apply to projects that are only required to do a construction building permit. So when it only applies if you're going through the planning processes. So tier 1 is mandatory for projects that are going through site plan control and plan of subdivision. Tier 2 is completely voluntary, and we've been directed to look at an incentive program for that, which we'll be starting engagement on later this year, and then we're putting back to committee and council on options for it in 2024. And then the last piece is the city's green building policy, which we've been directed to look at updating to align with tier 2 of the high performance development standard, which addresses the city's corporate new construction projects. So what we've proposed to committee and council in terms of our rollout and monitoring, and that this is up for a vote, as I mentioned earlier, at council on May 10th. So it would be coming into effect on July 1st of this year. And then the review and approval is through our planning services process. And then full compliance is required for the standard unless there's, although we do have some deviation pathways if there's sufficient justification provided or an alternative pathway proposed. In particular, I'll note the energy efficiency metrics. While we're going to require reporting on them starting July 1st, they're not mandatory until January 21st, 2024. So it's sort of a report only for 6 months to get familiar with the process of how it will get implemented and then come into effect in January. And part of the reason for that lag is also the province has indicated potential update to the Ontario Building Code, which may relate to green development standards, and we want to make sure we're prepared for what happens in that, and that could be coming out as early as this summer. And then we've been directed to review and update the high performance development standard every 4 years. So similar to what was mentioned with what Toronto does, the sort of model we're envisioning is that the tier 2 energy performance targets that are part of our first version would become the future versions tier 1. That will be subject to council review and approval in 2025 and to come into effect 2026. So the timelines. So the high performance development standard in site plan, we have 12 metrics. These are all listed here. So it covers energy, health, ecology, resiliency, waste, and mobility. Some of these pieces refer back to other requirements, such as the mobility pieces refer to the zoning bylaw, which is going through engagement for full update currently. And I getting what year, I think it'll be 2024, 2025, that the next version of the zoning bylaw will come into effect. And and could have implications for electric vehicle parking requirements and increases in bike storage and access. So I'll focus today on the energy piece, but this kind of gives you the big picture of what we're covering. For a plan of subdivision, we only have 3 metrics. We have the community energy plan, and then 2 requirements related to ecology. So for site plan for building energy efficiency, the objective is through exterior measures and early design decisions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with operations of new buildings. The energy targets, we have a few different pathways for energy targets, but the one we're sort of pushing for and encouraging the most is this intensity pathway. So the sort of principle of it is reduce your energy loads through passive design first, and that's measured through the thermal energy demand intensity. And then the next step is improve the efficiency overall, and that would be measured primarily through the total energy use intensity. And then the last piece is connecting to low carbon energy sources, which is measured through the greenhouse gas emission intensity target. I'll go through briefly kind of how we think these pieces factor into the site plan review process. I'm sure with energy experts in the room, this is all kind of old news to all of you, but the first kind of thing that gets set at site plan is what's the form of the building. And I think going back to the natural world, it's very easy to envision which form within these 2 options is going to be the more energy thermally efficient design. As well as so then the next piece is insulation, which has implications at that early site plan stage for where you want to be putting the exterior line of your building and how that relates to the zoning requirements and how that might impact usable floor space in the building. So all those kinds of decisions, although you might not have all the details of the wall assemblies at these early site plan stages, they certainly can factor into how the site plan is designed. Thermal bridging, so in particular, the modeling requirements that we have, which we've followed what the Toronto Green Standard uses. So we're using the same modeling programs in order to try and be consistent and minimize having to learn new programs. So in particular, thermal bridging is a big part of this and something that in other modeling approaches sort of has been given a little bit of a gimme, and that not all thermal bridging elements have been counted in previous modeling approaches, but in the one that we've been using with the Toronto Green, the same one as the Toronto Green Standard, more thermal bridging elements are factored into the modeling protocol. So that might have implications for how we're designing the buildings, and whether or not there's going to be full balconies for every unit or just some units, or how buildings might respond in that sense. The next piece is window design. So the targets, which I'll get into in a minute, are pretty strict, and certainly it's going to inform what type of windows and how many of them and what form they might take in terms of the performance of the building. So those will be big decisions for meeting the standards. Orientation. So at site plan, there's usually not a lot that can be done with respect to orientation, but there can sometimes be novel solutions. And this is an example locally where the tower of the building was reoriented to respond to the due south position in order to maximize solar heat gain for their solar wall. I already kind of went through these, so I'll go through them quickly. So window design and number. So even just how they're designed can have a big impact to the thermal energy demand for the building. This is the same, otherwise the same windows and same area of windows, but the one on the right has a 20% improvement over the one on the left, just to give a sense of how much that can have an impact. Exterior shading devices are another window design feature that we factored in. The next sort of main principle being airtight construction, and the decisions being made at the site plan stage in terms of architectural articulation and architectural embellishments will all have implications for airtight construction. That's not to say you can't have those things. It's just as you're thinking about the design, they're going to have implications for them. And then the last piece, at the site plan stage, you won't know your complete mechanical design, but there are certain decisions that should start being considered at that early stage in order to inform how the building might be able to achieve the energy targets. So just quickly, the building energy efficiency, there are some projects that are exempt from the energy efficiency requirement. So it's projects below the HPDS development threshold, which aligns with the complex applications. So for residential projects, that's projects under 14 units. And I don't have in my notes at the moment what the commercial building size is, but most larger projects would be under that complex application size threshold. So buildings not subject to energy requirements under the Ontario Building Code, such as temporary use buildings or farm buildings, are exempt from the energy requirements, as well as projects not subject to site plan control performance development standard. This was kind of covered briefly, but we have 3 pathways in terms of approaches to building energy performance. We have a prescriptive pathway, a reference building approach, and an absolute performance target approach. So the prescriptive approach is a certification pathway. The reference building is a modeling comparison to a reference building, and then absolute performance is these energy use intensity targets. So these are the 3 options for energy efficiency demonstrated for the high performance development standard core site plan. So energy use intensity, 25% carbon emission reduction compared to a reference building, or commitment to pursue a certification program. In terms of documentation, so the applicant's required to provide energy brief outline at site plan application, and then provide the HPDS development, HPDS checklist outlining the energy performance targets, as well as the energy modeling report as a condition of approval for site plan. So it's not required right at the site plan submission stage, but required before you can clear the conditions and move on to building permit stage. And we're using a third-party review process for the review of the documentation for energy. So our file lead will receive the energy modeling report and then work with a third party to support in the review of the energy modeling report.
May I interrupt?
Yeah.
That in that previous slide there.
Yeah.
This is a recent change, is it not? That this 2-stage process of an energy brief at the start and then in the end.
That's correct. Yeah. Good flag. It's we prior to going for a report to council committee this past week, we did some engagement, and it's related to, I'm not sure how much all of you have been following the site plan changes coming from the province that have sort of impacted all of our processes, but in the consultation, and as we were starting to look at the details of the new timeline requirements and the review processes for site plan application, we came to the conclusion through consultation that the approach we should take is that we have a brief at the site plan application and then have it as a condition of approval, so that we're able to make sure that we meet the new provincially mandated review timelines for site plan.
Similar to TGS.
I don't actually, I don't want to speak for Toronto, but I don't know that they are following that same process. They may still continue to have it be part of their site plan review process.
Okay.
So here are the energy use intensity targets. This is just the kind of the detailed numbers for multi-unit residential buildings, commercial buildings, commercial retail. Much more to say on that. This is what the checklist will look like. So it's really just filling out what the projected energy use is, what your floor area is, and then the checklist will calculate your energy use intensities for you. And then it's kind of built into the checklist. It'll go green if you've met the requirement, and it'll be red if you haven't met the requirement. For option 2, it's a comparison to the reference building, and it's a carbon emission reduction. What I've been hearing from some energy modelers that have started to dig into this is that this pathway could be quite difficult because the reference building approach doesn't necessarily give you full benefit for changing of mechanical systems, because your mechanical systems are you're comparing like with like for your mechanical systems.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, how is the reference building determined? Like, what is the reference building?
It'd be an Ontario building code building.
Okay, with the exact same like dimensions and like
Yes.
the modeled. Okay.
Yeah, it's all written out pretty clearly in the NECV.
Yeah.
But the big issue is if you put in a heat pump in your proposed building, you also put a heat pump into your reference building. So it becomes very difficult to meet this 25% better carbon emissions because your heat pump is already there.
So it doesn't use like what would be standardized, like more standard in what would meet code for the HVAC side.
Unfortunately,
Okay.
it'd be very nice if you could reference building a gas.
Yeah.
It's moving benchmark.
Yeah. The other thing that I've seen this criticism more so on the embodied carbon side when we're looking at reference buildings, but I don't know if I don't really have an opinion on this, but curious to hear kind of from the room, from embodied carbon side for reference building, they don't take into account if you decide to like change your building shape or size to fit the same needs of the building, but like take that into account, like reduce the amount of size that you need, not have wasted space. And so that actually would reduce for embodied carbon, your embodied carbon, it would also reduce your operational energy. Is that considered in this or no?
Well, I think that's the challenge with the reference building approach and why we have this energy use intensity target approach, because it's well, I guess actually for an intensity, if it's an intensity target,
fair, yeah,
it might actually hurt you by reducing your floor area from an operational carbon perspective.
Yeah.
But the idea being, if you're working
carbon.
towards a sort of absolute number of 0, you can kind of get those benefits a little bit more.
Yeah, it's just the way the reference building structure is set up. It ends up being awkward for this. How did you do better than the reference building?
Yeah.
And I wonder if you actually have the opportunity to rewrite how that is done within your own standard to actually be, logical to what we're trying to accomplish here.
We chose to not create new modeling pathways, that we wanted to use what was already available. I think there are lots of discussions happening on, where green development standards may go in the next few years. So it's possible that'll be part of the conversations that start happening going forward. So
The long and the short of it is most modelers are going to pick the absolute targets. It's a lot less work and it's a lot easier to hit when the reference building is so difficult to model with.
So would it be better to follow a prescriptive path, use the energy model as a tool to see if you're on the right path? Is it better?
Well, I'll get to the prescriptive. So the prescriptive path is essentially a certification pathway for the site plan approach. So, certainly you could do a certification pathway. The reason, and some of these certification, they're not exactly a like for like in terms of the energy use intensity targets, but the big advantage from the city's perspective to the certification pathway is that there is a measurement and verification aspect to it that the city in the site plan process has, once you've submitted your site plan, there's not a lot of recourse if you don't kind of complete and construct as intended. What software? I would have to refer you to the terms of reference for the software packages. I just saw it. But yeah, so I think probably option 1 and option 3 are going to be the most popular for a site plan application, but it may depend a little bit. Site plan does apply to, or can apply to, both Part 3 and Part 9. So the pathway might, the most popular pathways might vary a little bit depending on if we're talking about more typical commercial or large multi-unit residential, or a smaller kind of wood frame multi-unit residential.
So you did mention it a minute ago, but one of the previous criticisms kind of for this in Toronto as well was that you can approve it at the site planning stage, but then it never actually gets built as per, right? If you're following the certification one of those processes, you have some kind of M&B, but the reality is that not everyone's doing that, and most people aren't, especially on the residential side.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you have anything, or is there a plan in future years to try and incorporate some kind of M&B or something from the city? Because like, it's never going to happen. Like, you've set incredible goals, but it just won't happen if you're not actually following up on it. It's a reality versus what we hope. Like, you have amazing goals for 2040 and 2050, but it's just not going to happen. We should be real with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a challenge. We're limited to the authorities that we have in place. The province has signaled that they're looking at how to update the Ontario Building Code to kind of connect these planning application review processes and the building code processes. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. There may be some potential implications coming down the line with respect to that, which might help fill in some of these gaps. I will say, even with these limitations, the Toronto Green Standard has seen significant successes in transforming the market.
Absolutely.
Even with those limitations. So,
but it's
we're not necessarily getting us all the way there. It's a starting point to start that transition, and really, how can the city help inform and make that transition happen locally? So that's kind of the motivation and focus for us. But
I absolutely agree with it. It's amazing from that perspective. I'm just thinking, like, longer term, you're always going to have a fairly large portion of people that say you're going to do something, and the reality is you run out of budget eventually, right? And so what do you do to ensure, like, the city has made these promises, but the city won't be able to meet them if they don't follow up and have some kind of prescriptive way to say, hey, at the start, we've set this expectation, and we're expecting you to actually get there 5 years from now once the building's complete.
the city has set targets and not sort of set promises.
A target is an expectation.
I think regardless, the other thing I'll kind of point to and mention is our Better Buildings Ottawa program, which is, setting the path to kind of start with the supporting the benchmarking, which Ontario has benchmarking requirements, although it's fairly limited to larger size buildings. But we're trying to increase participation in that benchmarking to more buildings with a long-term potential vision of going to regulation on that operational side of things. So there are things that might come that would have that operational M&B side, because this is really focused on the new construction piece, but every new construction building becomes an existing building.
For sure.
And you hand over the keys. So that's kind of where it would tie back into the other energy evolution projects that we have.
It's a great idea.
So when we set this prescriptive path, shouldn't be built it into our building permit application, which is kind of it is right now. Engineers signed the 90.1, letter and said we confirm to Energy Code, OBC, yada, yada, yada. But then when we start with this targets, let's say go with prescriptive at the planning stage and go to permit, how city can help or enforce the requirement and when they actually sign the occupancy letter. Right now, city accepts, basically give occupancy letters to building as long as, yes, you have plumbing, you have the sewage, you have heating, and then you have some sort of ventilation. Is it as per building code as design intent? Should be any major verification strategy or some sort of verification involved in handing over the occupancy letter, not just say, yeah, building generally is okay with the Ontario Building Code, but we don't know if it follows or comply with this kind of targets that was set at the planning stage of the building permit application.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our challenges right now is that our authorities come from the Planning Act, not from the Ontario Building Code Act. So our building permit review staff are only empowered with the authority to review with respect to on the Ontario Building Code. So it's a requirement. It's registered on the site plan agreement, which is a legal requirement, but we have limited, pathways for reviewing and enforcing it, the fact because it's not part of the building permit process, but what the province has signaled is that they are looking at where they can help to have the Planning Act authorities and the building code authorities kind of communicate with each other. And we'll have to see what happens with that. There's an update coming this summer, as well as, they've sort of signaled there's perhaps a longer term update happening as well. So there's a few things happening to try and fill in that gap, but there's still work to be done.
Do you work directly with the province to make recommendations like that?
We've started engaging with the province on that. Our first engagement was earlier this week, so it's all very new. Okay. We don't tell them what to do, but we'll give our thoughts and opinions on it.
Yeah, we are a major player in the whole decision making, or should be for the province at least. So I would assume they would take your recommendations into account.
Yeah, and the engagement was with all the municipalities that are looking at green development standards. So they certainly have been working with us, and I believe they've also reached out to the building code side. So they're sort of looking at both the sides of how to facilitate this.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. So community energy plans, that's.
Just before we move to that, interject. So I think the overall of it is the regulatory environment is a huge factor in how we can move forward.
Absolutely.
And it's controlled by a lot of different players with a lot of different authorizations. And no one piece is going to be the full solution. But to see this move forward by the city and to see them be able to advocate to the province are some of the steps, levers that we need towards our ultimate goals. So I think that's how I read it in a nutshell.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, good. It was a good time to pause. So yeah, is there anything more on the site plan before I move to the plan of subdivision stuff? Yeah.
What I'm gathering here is we could submit this energy model with the site plan approval and have that checked off at 30% design and theoretically not have to look at it again all the way through to building permit. Is that correct?
Yeah, once you have an approved energy model, that would be correct. That you wouldn't have to look at it again.
It'd be advantageous to a customer to get this in earlier rather than later, both because the model will be simpler. They won't have to make any changes later to their building if they don't meet their codes. Okay. No. I guess it is theoretically possible that somebody hits this standard but fails the SB 10 if they're using not using the reference building approach. You could theoretically hit your absolute targets, but if your reference building has a heat pump in it as well, and you have to model for SB10 to the reference building, you could theoretically fail it.
These are things we don't want to.
I'm,
You're right, though.
The experts like us too.
if you find that loophole, let me know.
It's a big problem is building permits.
It is a big problem.
Anyway, okay, well, that just popped into my head and I had to say that out loud. We'll move on.
It's just like if someone's pursuing lead and they have to meet building code requirements. Like
Yes.
it's two different baselines, and you have to just track your performance along the way.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know.
I'll just say for the SB10 requirement, there is still the prescriptive path.
True.
Yeah.
That is usually a more preferred path for a lot of designers because the prescriptive path in the building code isn't that innovative anymore. That most common building practices meet that requirement.
Need it, yeah.
That's usually the way to go. There's the performance method loophole reference building.
The other sort of thing that just to keep things confusing is that Ontario has committed to harmonization with the National Energy Code for buildings. And I think the commitment is it's 18 or 24 months after model National Building Code was approved. So within the next, I'd say at least 18 months, we will be seeing a new Ontario Building Code different than SB10. Lots of things changing. So community energy plans. So that's, this is our plan of subdivision requirements. We're really, the intention of community energy plans is to really start early considerations to enable these zero carbon solutions at the community scale and remove some of these roadblocks that communities might start to see when you start seeing lots of buildings wanting to go to a zero carbon solution. There might be utility or grid constraints if you haven't built those into the design. So when we're building new communities, we're starting to think about that early on. So, you know, your community energy plan is setting that overall direction, and then it's working with your utility plans and your detailed building designs to kind of all work together towards that same goal. So some of the sort of things that will be important to kind of think about with these net zero emission communities. So I'll just kind of pull out an example. When we start talking about net zero energy homes, if we're going to fully electric for a whole subdivision, is the utility connection set up to deal with that kind of building design? At the moment, I don't think most plans of subdivision would be able to go fully electric for all of their homes. They would have to kind of have that early conversation with their hydro provider to make sure that what's getting put in the ground and built out early on is able to be right sized for what their future energy demands are going to be.
So is that something you're laying out like a pathway for?
So the requirement is to complete a community energy plan. There's sort of there's a modeling pathway for the community energy plan, or there's a prescriptive pathway. The modeling pathway, I think, isn't going to be very common or popular. I think it'll be mostly popular for those communities that have sort of that vision toward and commitment to a sort of net zero and want to have those conversations with their utility partners and want to be recognized for having those conversations and have them early. I think most likely majority of projects will pursue a prescriptive path. The way we kind of envision it is we've set out the community energy plan requirements. If used effectively, I think it's essentially a communication tool to start those conversations and have it in an informed way so that all your utility partners can, like, you're mutually working together and supporting each other to sort of facilitate that transition. The community energy plan requirements are somewhat less prescriptive because there are so much variability in the types of projects and the types of solutions the projects might see, as well as ownership structures are going to be very varied in that, you might have somebody who's just a land developer and then selling off all the various lots to individual building owners. And so that adds, layers of complexity. So we've left it a little bit more loose in terms of how it will get implemented because of those kind of unknowns for project to project.
Rebecca, hitting net zero in residential is not that tough. I need a 200 amp panel and an air source heat pump. And that's all these communities need. The really big impact on carbon is making sure that gas doesn't go into a subdivision.
And make sure there's enough electricity to put a 200 panel.
200 amp panel.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A 200 amp panel in every house is not how most of these subdivisions are currently being.
But it's because it's not the cheapest way to do it, but they should be. Like, it's that easy. You literally just need to run a 200 amp panel to every house.
If the electricity provider.
Well, you can just put that in your community energy plan, have the conversation with hydro. And
One other thing, which is also a bee in my bonnet, just have to be careful with the trees. I can't hit net zero with trees blocking the solar panels on the roof, right? So I know the city advocates trees and because of heat island effect, we probably should, but we should be strategic about it and not put the trees on the south face of the building, or make short trees in front of the south face of the building. Right. And nobody talks about that. Everybody talks about, let's put trees in, but we have to be a little bit careful, strategic about it.
Well, that's actually an Ottawa City, I don't want to say issue, but basically, like, you can plant so on city property, you're not technically allowed to plant trees that don't meet the Ottawa City guidelines. The Ottawa City guidelines are very strict on how many trees and how close they can be. For example, you can only have one tree within 7 meters of the next tree on Ottawa City property, which is next to the road. So what you see often is that people if they want trees on the property for a lot of the benefits of having trees, they're putting them closer to the house, which then further block and shade the house, which has some benefits in summer, but negatives in winter. But if the city actually changed their tree planning for that, if they put them closer to the road, you'd likely, and allowed to make that further densification there, you'd likely see a lot less effect on the house, and you'd have benefits in the winter and reduction of natural gas use and things like that. But it's because the Ottawa, basically city, tree and forestry management don't communicate with the energy teams, and it's just, there's a lot of people trying to do good things, but they're not necessarily seeing how it affects the other part of the city management. We need better communication across the teams, basically. It's a huge issue that you can't put a tree within 7 meters of the next tree in any subdivision in Ottawa, or that just seems insane, to be honest, because as soon as you get onto your own property, you can put 20 trees right beside each other. And if you walk into any park that has a forest, all the trees are right beside each other. So it's kind of a weird thing there. But
extreme weather events now, that's not really an option.
Yeah, but you're not forward thinking, because if that single tree is outside of 7 meters, it's not anywhere near another tree. That tree falls down. Now you have 14 meters minimum to the next tree, kind of thing. So extreme weather events, you should have more trees, not less trees. And you should be planning to plant the right trees for the environment.
I think we should move on.
Yeah, it's not really related.
Every time I come and speak about CDS,
Passionate
we
people.
end up on trees. I don't know what happens.
It does affect energy savings.
It does. No one said this was easy.
That's for sure.
That's all right. So in terms of the applicant requirements for plan of subdivision, so the first step is provide a letter outlining the approach to the community energy plan at application, and then similar to the site plan process, provide the final community energy plan, either report or brief. I'll get into that in a second of the differences between the two, to clear the conditions for plan of subdivision. So that's part of the checklist. And in terms of review, it's a similar approach where we're using a third party consultant to support on the review. The way we sort of see this, I'm realizing that this slide normally has an animation, but I sent it as a PDF, so you can't see it. We sort of see community energy plans as a bit of a nested approach, and I like to compare this to the sort of nesting of planning. So from a municipal, like our municipal energy plan is our energy evolution strategy. That's sort of similar to our Ottawa official plan, which is how we plan for growth across the city. So sort of if we're going to try and draw some parallels to the planning process. And then at community energy plan, we have the new community stage, which is similar to our community design plans or our local plans. And then nesting one more down, we have a community energy plan or community energy plan brief for the subdivision stage. So sort of similar to the planning similarity, it's the actual plan of subdivision. And then the last step is that building energy model, which would be similar to your construction plans. So when is a community energy plan required? So we have two different requirements. We have a report or a brief, and then this is kind of the decision tree to help inform people as to whether or not they should be producing a report or a brief. Essentially, the brief is a little bit lighter in terms of its documentation requirements. So smaller projects or projects pursuing a prescriptive pathway can go with a community energy plan brief, whereas those going with the modeled pathway or those at the local or secondary plan level would go with a full community energy plan report. Overall, the process for community energy plan is assess what the impacts of the development are going to be, propose strategies to mitigate those impacts, put them in the report or brief, and submit for review. And then as part of the report or brief, there's a monitor and implementation section that the applicant identifies how they're planning to monitor and implement those targets through to construction. And if they're, it's not a requirement, but if they're able to, we do encourage monitoring post-construction as well. But that's very difficult for a lot of ownership structures to actually implement.
You need manpower for that too.
Pardon?
You need manpower for that. Monitor the post.
Yeah, or investment in
It's a third party.
measurement
Measurement.
and Wi-Fi on that. So similar, so we have performance or prescriptive pathways, both reference building or absolute targets. And this is just referencing the sections of our community energy plan in terms of reference where these are located. In terms of a report or brief, this is kind of the table of contents of what would be in a community energy plan. And it compares what's in a report versus a brief. So essentially you're looking at the description of the development, what's the existing context, what are your objectives, who are your partners, what's your methodology and approach, who did you consult? The terms of reference requires that utilities be provided the opportunity to feed into the community energy plan, but we don't have the authority to compel the utilities to participate. So it's just they're required to be provided the opportunity, and then if they choose not to participate, then the project can still proceed without their participation. And just have to work through the potential challenges for that. And then from an analysis perspective, you're looking at what's just identifying what the proposed scenario is. If you're doing a modeling approach, provide the analysis of the modeling. If you're doing a prescriptive approach, you're just identifying what that prescriptive approach is. And then lastly, identifying what your implementation, measurement, and monitoring will be. Yeah.
In your engagement with the utilities, were they excited about this? Were they hesitant? How did those conversations go?
I would say they're interested. And yeah, so like I think they're interested in participating, interested in how this may look. but we'll have to see how it kind of starts to roll out and
Right.
once it starts, they start having real demands and asks of them.
Yeah, for
to
sure.
Participate. And I know some utilities, like, I think it'll depend a little bit on the context of the size of the project, which utilities they're working with, in terms of their ability to get meaningful engagement on the project.
Thanks.
So from a targets and scenarios perspective, the modeling looks at, is asking to look at sort of 3 scenarios and then identifying what the proposed scenario is. So a business's plan scenario, 50% emission reduction scenario, and a net zero emission scenario. And those are based off of the assumptions in our energy evolution modeling report. The prescriptive pathway, so either can commit to energy use intensity targets for the individual buildings on the site. That's probably going to be more common if it's a commercial subdivision. So many commercial buildings, and those buildings would have to go through the site plan process anyway after the plan of subdivision. So that's kind of where that link up could come. It could be a commitment to pursue certification for individual buildings. That probably will have quite a bit of application for plans of subdivision that are primarily residential. And you might have a combination of those two if you have partially commercial, partially residential. Commitment to energy conservation pathways. So those are the prescriptive options, and that's it. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. Hopefully it is interesting.
That's awesome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It just goes back much earlier in the presentation, but you were talking about the commitments, like the goals and objectives. I get the corporate ones 100% because you have full control over those 100%. But for me and everybody else who owns a house or rents or something in the city of Ottawa, you're expecting or you're hoping or you're projecting that we're all going to go to zero carbon, zero footprint by a certain date. How is that going to happen? Disposable income, people are crying and complaining because there's far too much inflation. They're picketing in front of buildings because they want more wages. They can't put food on their tables, can't afford to do what they need to do to get that done. It's like how do we reconcile that? That's a big one. I'm sorry.
It's a challenging question. I will say the targets have been based off of climate science. Like we're not setting the targets based off of, this seems like a fun thing to do. It's based off of demands of our environment. We do have programs for within our Better Homes program to try and incentivize and bring individual building owners on board with participating in deep energy retrofits and helping to facilitate the financing of those. But it's a big challenge, and I don't think I have all the answers on how that's really going to all play out over the next 30 years or so.
So I feel like that needs to be a place where the municipality works closely with the province, who works closely with the nation, and then special interest groups to find solutions, right? Because everybody's building their targets. You have your aspirations, and they're all fantastic, and they're based on climate science. And I appreciate the climate science. I'm an engineer. Science is science. But the reality is you have a whole bunch of people, maybe half, that are earning barely enough to continue surviving in the house they have today. And I think there's no conceivable way, even with programs, that they're going to achieve what you're asking them to achieve anywhere near the timeline that you're hoping that they do it in. And it screws us all 100%. But I'm encouraging you to continue to advocate with others and to build consensus across multiple authorities, I think is what I'm trying to suggest.
Yeah, we certainly do participate in a lot of advocacy efforts. And like this is one part of our energy evolution strategy. We have the Better Homes program, but we also are looking at other collective action issues like how do we look at community heating as a whole across the community, and are there opportunities to facilitate district energy systems, and might offering connections to those kinds of systems be an option that enables people like individual buildings that don't want to do or can't do the retrofits on the building themselves, connect to the low carbon heating source and not have to do the individual one. So there's lots of, it's a big problem. There's lots of problems. There's lots of solutions. And we're going to be looking to partner with all those who can help offer support in getting us there.
Just to add to Andrew's question too, like from a community standpoint, like are we looking at, for example, what the Ontario government is doing with cleaning of the grid, and like maybe like electricity still has like carbon, and like as like historical emissions and trends are going. So is it like reducing and eliminating natural gas, maybe more expensive stuff like that? So is that closely tied to what also Ottawa is looking at?
Yeah, like one of our projects within Energy Evolution is electricity resource strategy, which is in large part working with provincial agencies or local utility providers to identify what the various challenges related to, in particular, electrification are for our community, but also, where are the opportunities? And then we're also looking at, what are the city planning, what are the ways from a city planning perspective we can support and enable renewable energy locally, those kinds of questions. There's a shortage of stuff to do.
Because like for community energy plan, it's less on the consumer or on the providers, right? To create that zero carbon strategy.
Yeah, like actually in the nesting of the community energy plan, like, when we're talking about the community energy plan from a plan of subdivision perspective, we're talking about community at that neighborhood level. And the city has the community energy plan at the city level, but there is the broader, provincial level as well of like how are we making sure we have enough electricity at the right times from the right resources in order to support our communities. And there are some plans at the like IESO level to participate and review in, but so lots more.
Rebecca, it's an opportunity to mention how good the city has been. The city is offering up to $125,000 loan at low interest for energy conservation measures. The federal government offers $40,000 at zero interest for energy conservation measures. Get an energy audit done, you figure out what you need to do with your house, and you do it, you plan forward. And it's amazing how relatively simple it is to move a house at zero. So it's never been better. And a good portion of that is because of the work that the city's done.
Yeah, that's our Better Homes Loan program.
Yeah.
It's certainly a great project, and
I actually took advantage of that loan myself. And I electrified my whole house as of December last year. So
congratulations.
That's awesome.
And I didn't go to 200 amps.
Do you have
189.
I do not have generation. I also have no backup.
Oh, really?
I want to take a moment just to also say that it is an extremely complicated problem. As Rebecca was also saying too, in terms of where we're going to go and all of the factors that have to align as we move forward. So I'll turn it back to Andrew and say, we need everyone to play their own role in making sure that all of the players know the direction that they all have to go to, right? And you take this all the way back to, say, 2019 and the climate strike that happened and the number of people that showed up. I actually think that made a difference to actually
politicians, municipal staff, federal staff, realizing, yeah, okay, we have to start listening and make those change happen. And when we've been seeing, like, we've been in this space for 5 years, it's been an incredible change over those 5 years in terms of the number of organizations that are starting to change their policies and move forward. It's awkward at times at knowing, well, what does that mean when you say that? But it's moving, and we do have to still, all of us, I think it's incumbent on all of us to continue to play our role in voicing our opinions and our support for policies that do make sense. Things like having a budget for the energy evolution team so that they can plan comprehensive programs where they do have the levers and advocate where they don't have the levers. That's, again, this is mostly my own personal hat of just all of this does matter. And then it ends up mattering to us in terms of my professional hat of having the work. We have the capabilities, we have the technologies, we have the brains to make change happen, but we need clients that are either regulated to make the changes happen or care to make the changes happen. And we're now starting to see both of those levers coming in to this. One of the really interesting things is on the financial sector side, they're starting to care about the carbon footprint of their loans, essentially their mortgages. So especially there's a posting about credit unions today. We're starting to hear that, a credit union that says, we need to care about our own assets, help us. So that those are the positive directions, and whatever your bank is, tell them you care. I think it's all starting to make an impact. Yeah.
I should mention that there were 2 comments and / questions online. One was James mentioning that Home at Best 4.0 addresses energy and carbon. And that was in response to my comment about not having a good retrofit certification standard to go to for people looking to retrofit for their tenants' sake to prove that. And Ian asked what software packages are acceptable for modeling. I know eQuest and ISVE are on the list. I think at one point HOT 2000 might be acceptable for the small builds. And I think there's another one that I can't recall off the top of my head, and I didn't look it up.
Energy Plus is yes.
Energy Plus, thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for kind of the presentations. I want to note that we had 2 incredible women speakers at this, and AE, we're wanting to have more women speakers at these types of things. I'm the lead for the CWHEEL group, the Council of Women in Energy and Environmental Leadership, for our AE Canada East group. So yeah, just wanted to note that exists. It's a thing within AE across kind of globally. If anyone's interested in getting involved or learning more, it's not just for women. We need everybody there, and we'll be having more events in that space as well. So keep your eyes open for new events as well. Thank you so much.